able to see and hear my screen? So can everyone see and hear my screen? Great. So as you just saw from Geshu, it's only me today. Fortunately, Geshu couldn't make it to Boston today. All right. Geshu couldn't make it to Boston today. So I'm going to try to speak slowly, clearly, make sure you guys can understand my English. But if I speak too fast at any point, let me know. And you can be assured that for future classes, either Geshu or a teaching assistant will be here with me to help translate what I say into Chinese. All right, cool. So it is 9:07 in the morning where I am, and probably 9:07 at night where you are. So I thought we might as well begin. So first of all, for those of you who I know from my class before, nice to see you again. For those of you who are new to this class, well, nice to meet you. My name's Trevor Klee, and this course is Western philosophy. I called it here philosophers in their own words, because as we'll find out, a big part of this course is not just understanding philosophy, but understanding philosophers, what they thought, how they wrote, how they spoke, their lives, that sort of thing. All right, so a bit about me. So I graduated from Princeton University, which is a college in New Jersey, pretty famous. And yeah, not too much more to say about that. If anyone has any questions, maybe I'll answer them at the end of the lesson, or maybe I'll even devote part of a future lesson just to answering questions about American universities. In my professional life, I spend a lot of my time doing tutoring for graduate exams, so GMAT, GRE, LSAT. If you want to know more about that side of my life, you can check out my website, which I've creatively named trevorkleetutor.com. Maybe not the most brilliant name, but it seemed very descriptive. And most importantly for this course is I'm a lover of philosophy, which is somewhat funny because, as you may know from Geshu, philosophy in Latin literally means lover of knowledge, right? Philo, so lover of knowledge. So I'm a lover of a love of knowledge. All right, cool. So format of the class. There's going to be 3 sections to this class. There's going to be how to think, or here's my chance to try to practice my Chinese. Zeme so that'll be 10 philosophers, 2 hours each, 20 hours. And when I say philosophers, it's also occasionally like a school of philosophy. So the existentialists, the utilitarians, or whatever. It's going to be how to live. So that's going to be both ethics and questions about how should you spend your day-to-day life. And that'll be next with 5 philosophers. Finally, how things should work, which are mostly going to be cities and countries. How do you put them together? What's the best way to rule one? What's the best way to structure one? And that's going to be 5 philosophers. In each class, we're going to go over a philosopher's life, the background to where they're living. So if they lived during the time of empires rise or fall, or if they live during a time of war or of prosperity. We'll go over that. We're going to go over their philosophy. We'll go over their philosophical background, so why did they think what they thought, and we'll look at how they argued. So basically, we're going to read their arguments directly and figure out how they put their individual points together. As you'll learn, we're covering like 2,000 years of philosophy. And even though it's all in the same tradition, there's been like huge variation in how people think you should prove your points. We're going over Socrates today, as you know, and his style of argument is so different from, for example, Wittgenstein, who we'll go over close to the end of the first section. And Wittgenstein is in the 20th century, and he's very formal, and he has all these very formal arguments that can actually be very difficult to understand. And then meanwhile, Socrates, even though he's writing 2,000 years ago, he argues very conversationally. It's very easy to understand his arguments because it sounds like people talk. And the goal of this class is by the end of this class, you're not only going to know the ideas of Western philosophy, but also with the practice of it. Because philosophy, as I've said before, is not just something that comes out of the sky and is just given to us by God or Zeus or, the sun. Philosophy is something that people did and something that people do. If you study philosophy, you should not only know what philosophy is, but how to do philosophy. So, last thing before we get into the fun stuff, which is the actual philosophy. So this is how to succeed in this class. So, first of all, before class, and I know this is a little unfair because you haven't seen this before this class, but for future classes, read the pre-reading. It's going to either, it's probably going to be Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which is a great book. And Bertrand Russell is a great philosopher. He's not, in my opinion, he's not important enough to be really remarked upon as a major figure in Western philosophy, like one that we would cover in this course, although some people would disagree. But he was certainly a brilliant man. So it'll probably be from that, and if not, it'll be from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and I think 1 or 2 times from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy or Wikipedia. So this should be very readable. Like, it actually is sometimes quite fun. Bertrand Russell's a great writer, and sometimes he's very funny. So that should be pretty doable. Take notes, read it, make sure you understand it, and then also try to read the philosopher himself. It's going to be more difficult, and that's why we do it in class. But you should make an effort. During class, pay close attention. These lectures are recorded, and there's also a Word document with everything that I talk about. So if you don't understand something, you can watch the lecture again. You can try to read what the teaching assistants are saying in the QQ chat box, and that'll make sure you really understand everything. Because that's the point. That's why you're spending this time, right? All right. After class, try the philosophy reading again. Complete the homework. Upload it to QQ. And then finally come to Reddit. There'll be a thread, and you'll understand what that means. But there'll be a thread where you can post your best homework response, and then you can come discuss philosophy. Which again, philosophy shouldn't just be something you sit back and passively receive. It should be something you participate in. And that's what Reddit is for this class. It's a chance to participate in the discussion of philosophy and to participate in philosophy. So if you follow all these instructions, you'll have a great understanding of Western philosophy by the end of this course. You'll be able to talk about it, you'll be able to think about it, you'll be able to learn about it on your own. If you don't follow these instructions, I mean, it's not like the sky's gonna crash down. I mean, I'm not gonna fail you or anything, but you're just not gonna get as much out of this class. Okay, so that ends my little pre-class spiel, little pre-class speech. So, 你听到了吗? Great. All right. Good stuff. Thank you. My Chinese isn't very good. My Chinese is good enough that when I speak it to Chinese people, they say good Chinese. But if I speak it to someone on the street, they say, "What are you saying?" But I'm working on it. I'm trying very hard. Okay. So on to the actual content of this course. Philosophy. And who are we starting with? But everyone's favorite curmudgeonly Greek, Socrates. So in many ways, Socrates is the first philosopher. This can be disagreed with, and people do have arguments about who else could be considered the first philosopher. But I think it's really Socrates, because he's he really goes about in a very systematic way. And his descendants, his intellectual descendants, are the most influential philosophers. So Socrates attempts to use logical reasoning and questioning to discover truth, to draw out innate knowledge, and tease out the contradictions and assumptions of language. So it's not great for discovering the world outside, but it's good for discovering what you already know, and it's good for figuring out what you're saying when you say something. If you say something's beautiful, or if you say something's good, or whatever, then Socrates is good for, well, the Socratic method, as it's called, is good for figuring that out. So I have a quote from Bertrand Russell here. The matters that are suitable for treatment by the Socratic method are those to which we have already enough knowledge to come to a right conclusion, but have failed through confusion or thought or lack of analysis to make the best logical use of what we know. So Bertrand Russell is basically saying what Socrates is good at is you already know what you need to know, but you haven't come to the right conclusion yet. And Socrates can help you come to the right conclusion. And that's actually a pretty big deal for philosophy, right? So, as promised, let's go over the biography of Socrates. And this here is Socrates. So this is a very famous painting of Socrates when he commits suicide. I maybe should have said spoiler alert, but he does commit suicide, he does die. And here it does somewhat look like he's bothering his students, but really because this is a Renaissance painting, Socrates is always portrayed with his finger pointed up because it's like to the and meanwhile, everyone else here is his students, and they're obviously very distressed. And this is the hemlock which Socrates drinks, which kills him. So Socrates was born in Athens, which was the most powerful Greek city-state at the time, in 470 BC, to a stonemason and a midwife. So it's not a noble family, it's not a rich family. By the way, in case you're wondering what a city-state is, if maybe you haven't studied much Greek history or Western history, It's what it sounds like. At this point in Greek's history, each city was its own country, basically. It made its own laws and it had its own rules and whatever. So Socrates served in the Athenian military, and he was renowned for his hardiness and self-control. He was very, very tough. There's actually a great story in the document, which again, you guys can read on your own or follow along with me. Is Socrates is in the military, and in the cold, it's like gets very cold in Greece. They have no food. They don't have not enough clothes. There's snow on the ground. And everyone's bundled up in furs and fleeces and whatever, and they're shivering. And Socrates is barefoot in just normal clothes, just like this, walking on the ice. And as Plato says, he marches better than the other soldiers who had shoes, and they looked daggers at him because he seemed to despise them. So Socrates, he's so tough, he doesn't care about cold, he doesn't care about hunger, and the other soldiers hate him for this. Because he seems to hate them. He seems to say, look at you, look at how weak you are, look at how strong I am. So after Socrates gets out of the military, he becomes the gadfly of the state. And a gadfly is like a biting insect. And the reason I use that word is because that's how Socrates describes himself. He annoys politicians and powerful men, and in doing so, as you might expect, a lot of rich young men find him very, very appealing, and they follow him. And so Socrates is eventually put on trial because he annoys enough people. His technical crime is dishonoring the gods and corrupting the youth. So corrupting the youth makes sense. All these rich young men are following him, and they too are somewhat disrespectful. He chooses to die instead of being exiled or anything like that. And as we'll see, we actually have an account of his trial. When he chooses to die, he very much does it deliberately. Instead of saying, oh, please spare me, when like the judge is like, we think you should die, but maybe you can choose another sentence, Socrates is like, well, on the other hand, if I don't die, you could also consider paying me for my services and improving the Athenian state. So he really chooses death. And there's the famous Socratic problem here. So the Socratic problem, Socratic meaning Socrates, is we don't actually know that much about Socrates. So we have really two accounts. We have Plato and Xenophon, who are his students. Plato is brilliant, and we'll read his philosophy later on, and we'll also discuss like his influence with his student Aristotle. But part of the problem with Plato being so brilliant is it seems pretty clear that his accounts of things make Socrates sound better than he actually was. So like when he supposedly records what Socrates said, it's probably Plato making Socrates sound a lot better. On the other hand, our only other option is Xenophon, who is quite frankly not that smart. And so when we read his account of what Socrates said, Socrates is sort of boring and not that intelligent, so it's hard to believe. Well, for one thing, when you like read Xenophon's account of the trial, which we won't do, it's hard to believe that Socrates would ever have been put to death in the first place, because, well, it's pretty boring and inoffensive. And finally, our last thing is a satirical portrayal by Aristophanes. Satirical here meaning makes fun of him. So that's the Socratic problem. There's not great accounts for Socrates' life. What people mostly use is Plato, and we just have to be aware that maybe it's a better version of Socrates' life than should really be. All right, so let's talk about the historical background. So Socrates is alive during one of the most incredible times in history. And actually, for future generations, for the West, they talk about, or they're going to be very jealous of how amazing this time is. So this is ancient Athens is declining, but it's also the golden age of Greece. So first of all, Socrates' students are maybe the two most influential men in Western history. Plato and Aristotle. As I'll mention in the next class, which is about Aristotle, if we did Western philosophy by percentage of time, so we spent the most time on people who had the longest amount of influence, this course would literally be 80% just talking about Aristotle and Plato, and then in the other 20%, everyone else. So they are very, very influential. So there's also not just philosophy going on during this time. You have the first playwrights. I don't know if you guys have ever read Western literature, but names like Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes. If you've ever read Oedipus or heard about it, that's when the story comes about. You have the first historians. You have the first doctors. You have one of the greatest statesmen of all time. You have the first real mathematicians. And it's not like no one's ever tried to tell the story of what's happened before, or no one's ever tried to cure someone else before, no one's ever tried to govern a state before. But there's a logical system being built. There's stuff being written down of this is the best way to do it, and this is why it's the best way. It's really a big advance in just human history when we start thinking about what's the best way to do this sort of stuff. So it's a very exciting time intellectually, but it's very scary militarily, because right about when Socrates dies, or a couple of years before, Sparta, which is another city-state, which is entirely military-based and slave owning, and their entire economy is based on owning slaves, and they don't believe in arts or music or anything. They defeat Athens in battle, and they don't only defeat it, but they absolutely dominate it. Athens loses its position as the most powerful city-state in Greece, and it'll never again be that successful. If you guys saw the movie 300, those are the Spartans. 300 portrayed them as a lot better than they actually were. They were great warriors, but they were also, well, they owned slaves and they killed a lot of people. So, I mean, as someone who's a philosopher and believes in sort of the better things in life, I can't really support them. By the way, this is a famous painting. And here we've got Socrates pointing up. We've got Plato who's pointing down. Remember, Plato, Socrates' most famous student. And then we have other various, things going on. We have discussions. We have arguments. Looks like someone who drank a little too much. But this is sort of the European idea of the golden age of Athens. This is a time during which everyone is sort of brilliant. It's an amazing time, as I said. All right, before we go on to the philosophy, everyone understands Socrates' biography and historical background. Okay, great. So let's talk about Socrates' philosophy then. So Socrates' philosophy is a little hard to determine because Socrates doesn't make that many definitive statements about what he actually believes. But we don't actually care about that much, though. What we really care about is the Socratic method. And this is his style of arguing. Um, it's what Plato referred to as maieudics, or midwifery, or like when you help a child be born. And the idea is, like you're helping a child be born, Socrates helps an idea be born. He brings out what someone actually believes, and he asks them questions, and he shows that their beliefs are in contradiction. Um, his essential method, which we'll see, is he identifies what they believe, he negates it, he says that's wrong, and then he explains why by analogy. And then normally he'll expand it and he'll say, not only is what you believe wrong, but the foundations of what you believe are wrong. And then he'll go back to step 2. And before you know it, he'll sort of prove to the other person that everything that they think is on shaky foundations. And famously, his saying is, nobody knows anything, and the reason why I'm the smartest man alive is at least I know that I don't know anything. And this is a little comic here. Remember the painting from before? This is Socrates' alternative argument during his trial, which is, what if we convince the jury that while they're wasting their time with me, the real Socrates is still at large? Just a fun little comic I found. All right, I think. So let's look at an example of the Socratic method. So we've got two friends of Socrates, Lamachus, and Melesius, related as L and M because I don't feel like remembering ancient Greek names. They're wondering whether or not to train their sons as warriors. So Lysimachus asked Socrates, Melesius, and Nicias what he should do. And Nicias is just another friend of them. So we've got two people wondering whether to train their sons as warriors, and this is a big deal in ancient Greece. You know, they're constantly fighting, and so the question of whether or not to be trained as a warrior is a very important question. So Lysimachus asks his friends what he should do. So Socrates starts by saying, "What, Lysimachus, are you going to accept the opinion of the majority?" So Socrates says, are you just going to accept whatever most of us say we should do? And Lysimachus says, "Why, yes, Socrates, what else am I to do?" Socrates responds, "And would you do so too, Melesius? If you were deliberating about the gymnastic training of your son, would you follow the advice of the majority of us or the opinion of one who had been trained and exercised under a skillful master?" And gymnastic training here is like fitness, which has to do with being a warrior, but it's not the same thing. It's just general fitness. So he's identifying a thesis here. He's saying, is it best to figure out whether to train your son as a warrior by accepting the opinion of the majority? And then Socrates is going to argue by analogy that that's not a good idea. He says, well, what if you were thinking about fitness? Would you ask your friends? Would you follow the advice of the majority of us? Or would you follow the opinion of the one who had been trained and exercised under a skillful master? So would you ask just your friends, or would you ask someone who knows something about fitness? And Melesius, of course, says the latter, Socrates, as would surely be reasonable. So, you know, I'd ask someone who knows something about fitness. I wouldn't just ask my friends. Socrates brings the point home. He says his one vote would be worth more than the vote of all of us four. Melesius says, certainly. Socrates says, and for this reason, as I imagine, because a good decision is based on knowledge, not on numbers. So now Socrates is establishing a general thesis, right? Good decisions are based on knowledge and not on numbers. Melesius says to be sure. So Socrates now comes back and he applies it to the question at hand. He makes his analogy clear. Must we not then, first of all, ask whether there's any one of us who has knowledge of that about which we are deliberating? If there is, let us take his advice, though he be one only, and not mind the rest. If there is not, let us seek further counsel. So he says, isn't the first thing we should do is ask, is there an expert? If there is an expert, let's ask him. If there's not an expert, let's find an expert. And is this a slight matter about which you and Lysimachus are deliberating? Are you not risking the greatest of your possessions? For children are your riches, and upon their turning out well or ill depends the whole order of their father's house. So Socrates says, it really is important for us to find an expert, because this isn't like just something small. This is about how you should educate your children, which is presumably he says it's your riches. This is the most important decision of your life. You should be not just asking your friends, you should ask an expert. Melesius has to agree. He says that is true. You'll notice in these dialogues, whoever is not Socrates never has that much to say. Certainly, to be sure, that is true. Socrates says, great care then is required in this matter. Certainly. All right, so Socrates has now established his thesis. He's negated the other thesis. So now he's going to expand. He's going to not just content with questioning the original foundations, he's going to question the foundations of their whole thought pattern. Suppose, as I was just now saying, that we were considering or wanting to consider who is the best trainer. Should we not select him who knew and had practiced the art and had the best teachers? So this is a pretty clear analogy. If we were trying to figure out who the best personal trainer is, fitness trainer, we'd think about who had the best teachers and who knew fitness. Melesius says, I think that we should. Socrates says, would there not arise a prior question about the nature of the art of which we want to find the masters? So Socrates says, is there not a question before this about the nature of the art, about what we're really talking about, And Melesius, as you might feel now, says, I do not understand. Wo bu mingbai. So Socrates says, let me try to make my meaning plainer then. I do not think that we have as yet decided what that is which about we are consulting when we ask which of us is or is not skilled in the art, has or has not had a teacher of the art. Socrates says, well, let's question the foundations of this argument. What exactly are we wondering? Who is this expert? What should he be an expert in? And Nicias is, of course, very confused. He says, is not the question whether young men ought or ought not to learn the art of fighting in armor. Because Nicias says, okay, I've agreed with you. Like, I should ask an expert about whether my son should be trained as a warrior, so the expert should be a warrior. Like, that would seem to make sense. But Socrates says, well, actually, yes, Nicias, but there is also a prior question, which I may illustrate in this way. When a person considers about applying a medicine to the eyes, would you say that he is consulting about the medicine or about the eyes? So again, Socrates goes for an analogy to expand the thesis. He says, if you're thinking about applying a medicine to the eyes, are you asking about the medicine or about the eyes? And this is a little unclear, so let's see where Socrates goes with this. Nicias, of course, says about the eyes. If you get an eye infection and you go to the doctor, you're not asking about the medicine, you're asking about the eyes. And Socrates says when he considers whether he shall set a bridle on a horse, and that's just the part of a horse that helps you ride it, and at what time he is thinking of the horse and not of the bridle. So when you're thinking about putting like stuff on a horse to help you ride it, you're thinking about the horse, you're not thinking about the stuff to help you ride it. Nicias says, true. Socrates essentially says, in a word, when he considers anything for the sake of another thing, he thinks of the end and not of the means. So now Socrates establishes an even bigger thesis. When you're thinking about anything, you're thinking about the end. You're thinking about what you're trying to accomplish. You're not thinking about how you're accomplishing it. How you're accomplishing it isn't as important as what you're accomplishing. So Nicias says, certainly. Socrates says, when you call in an advisor, you should see whether he too is skillful in the accomplishment of the end which you have in view. So Socrates says, when you're looking for an expert, you should not just be considering how you're going to accomplish it, but can he accomplish the thing which you want to accomplish? And Nicias says, most true. And Socrates says, and at present we have in view some knowledge of which the end is the soul of youth. And Nicias says yes. So we're going to stop with this dialogue for a little bit, or stop with this dialogue for now. As you can see, it goes on, and the next thing that Socrates is going to argue about is that what you're really concerned with is the ends here, which is the soul of youth, or the best way to raise a son. You're not just asking whether or not to raise a son as a warrior. So your expert shouldn't be someone who is a warrior. Your expert should be someone who knows how best to raise a son. So let's summarize this. Identifies a thesis. It is best to come to the conclusion of how to teach your son by a popular road. Negates the thesis. He says, no, it is not best to come to the conclusion of teach your son by a popular road. Then he argues by analogy. And this isn't like a super complex analogy. It's like very much common sense of his conversation partners. It's all things they already know. He says, if we were discussing gymnastic training, we wouldn't put it to a popular vote. All right, then Socrates attempts to expand the negation of the thesis. He says, well, we're not really discussing how to teach your son. We're not really discussing just this. We're discussing something bigger. We're discussing whether to teach your son the art of war. What's the ends here? And then the way he does this again is by analogy. And it's again with things that his conversation partners already know. When we put a bridle on the horse, we are concerned about the horse, not of the bridle. Okay, so I know that was pretty difficult, and I see there's a fair amount of discussion. PowerPoint full size. Yes, I can do that. Should be better. I see there's a fair amount of discussion going on in the QQ chat. So before I go on, are there any questions in English that I can address? My Chinese reading ability is very poor. So there's no questions that you guys have. You understand everything that's going on. Okay. Cool. Then let's keep going. So let's go for our second example of the Socratic method. And so this one, you're going to have to be a little patient because this one gets pretty strange. So Socrates is talking to another friend, Menexenus. Yeah, I don't know if this is a common name. I don't know anything about ancient Greek names, but his name is Menexenus, and he's talking about the nature of friendship. Socrates is talking about the idea that the deepest friendships come from opposites because opposites fill needs in one another. Socrates is not convinced by this idea. He says, and yet there is a further consideration. May not all these notions of friendships be erroneous, but may not that which is neither good nor evil still in some cases be the friend of the good. So this starts off from the bat. It's pretty strange. So Socrates is saying, is it possible that we're wrong about our ideas of friendship? And he says, maybe that which isn't good or evil will be the friend of the good. And remember, he's relating this to the idea of friendship between people where opposites are friends. And Menexenus is as confused as we are, and he says, how do you mean? Socrates says, why really the truth is I do not know, but my head is dizzy with thinking of the argument, and therefore I hazard the conjecture. So Socrates isn't sure himself, but he wants to lay this out here. He wants to see what his friend thinks of his argument. It says, the beautiful is the friend, as the old proverb says. Beauty is certainly a soft, smooth, slippery thing, therefore of a nature which easily slips in and permeates our soul. For I affirm that the good is the beautiful. You will agree to that? So this is very confusing here. And it's confusing to me, and it's confusing to a modern audience, because Socrates is describing beauty in a way that, like, we would say is pretty poetic. He says it's soft, smooth, slippery. Okay, that's poetic. That's nice. Of a nature which easily slips in and permeates our souls. Also a nice way of putting it. And he says the good is the beautiful. That sounds nice. And then he says you will agree to that. So he's using this, what we would just call like poetic language, as the foundation of his argument, which is very strange. And I think if we as modern readers were here now, we'd be like, what are you talking about? But Menexenus is okay with it. He says yes. And then Socrates, again, he's trying to establish thesis, negate it, expand it. So he says, this I say, this is currently him in like a analogy phase, or this I say from a sort of notion that what is neither good nor evil is the friend of the beautiful and good, and I will tell you why I'm inclined to think so. I assume that there are three principles: the good, the bad, and that which is neither good nor bad. You'd agree, would you not? So, I mean, he's negating the thesis that like opposites attract, and we get that, but then it's hard to understand what his current thesis would even mean. Neither good nor evil is the friend of the beautiful and the good. Okay, sure. We've said before, beautiful is the same thing as good. He says there are three principles: the good, the bad, and that which is neither good nor bad. Now, we sort of get what this means, but for the Greeks, these are real descriptions, as we'll find out. It's like this is really a way you can use to divide up the world. It's good, it's bad, it's neither good nor bad. Menexenus says, I agree. And Socrates says, the good isn't the friend of the good, the evil of the good, nor the good of the evil. So these alternatives are excluded by the previous argument. Therefore, if there be such a thing as friendship or love at all, we must infer that which is neither good nor evil must be the friend either of the good or of that which is neither good nor evil, for nothing can be the friend of the bad. So this is, again, strange argument. The good isn't the friend of the good, the evil of the good, nor the good of the evil. I guess it makes sense with his definitions, but I don't know what he'd mean practically. Nothing can be the friend of the bad. I don't know what that means practically, but Menexenus is still okay with it. He says, true. And like can't be the friend of like, as we were just now saying. Okay, if so, that which is neither good nor evil can have no friend which is neither good nor evil. So let's figure out what exactly Socrates is meaning by this. This is all a very strange argument. It started out poetic and now it's getting into logic, which we're not sure. So Menexenus says clearly not. Apparently Menexenus is either more clever than us or something, because he has no problem with this. He says clearly not. Good alone is the friend of that which is neither good nor evil. That may be assumed to be certain. And then we get into what Socrates means practically. Does that not seem to put us in the right way? The body which is in health requires neither medical nor any other aid, but is well enough. And the healthy man has no love of the physician because he is in health. So you sort of get where he's coming from here. Now he's going to say the healthy man doesn't love the physician. Next it says he is the sick man loves the physician because he is sick. Certainly. And sickness is evil and medicine is good. So you see where his analogy is going, but like the logic behind this is very strange, not least of which because, again, we would say it's a clever analogy to say sickness is evil. And it's a clever analogy to say medicine is good, but then to use that as your example for what is a tract is sort of crazy. Menexenus says, yes. Socrates says, the human body is neither good nor evil. True. Socrates says, body is compelled by reasons of disease to court and make friends of the art of medicine. Yes. So then that which is neither good nor evil becomes the friend of good by reason of the presence of evil. So we may infer. So Socrates brings the whole argument home here with an analogy, using the common sense of his companions. So it's the same thing as like he was doing before, except now he's just categorizing things. And the Greeks love categorizing things. And they think they're really discovering things about the world when they categorize things. When they say sickness is evil, or the human body is neither good nor evil, or the sick is the friend of the physician, like they're not only saying this is like true metaphorically or this is true poetically, they're actually trying to understand the world with this. Luckily for us, philosophy as a whole generally abandons this because it's not, well, it's just quite frankly not great philosophy. As you guys saw, the same argument form that seemed very clear when we were talking before about the way to train your son gets very strange when it talking about good, evil, and neither good nor evil. However, as strange and annoying as they are, we have to keep an eye on them. We have to pay attention to them because one of Socrates' intellectual descendants, who we'll talk about next time, also loves categorizing things, and that's Aristotle. So that's the reason why I bring it up. But it is, if you guys read Socrates on your own, what you'll find is that some of his arguments seem very, very clever. And you'll say, wow, Socrates was a really smart guy. And then some of them will seem completely off the wall. And a big reason for that is because he will be using categories that, quite frankly, just don't seem real. And so when he says things like, the good is the friend of the good, neither is the good the friend of the good, nor the evil of the good, or he says there are three principles, the good, the bad, and that which is neither good nor bad. When Menexenus is very okay with this, but us as a modern audience, we wouldn't even agree to this. We don't even know what this means. So by the time we get to the conclusion of the argument, he's completely lost us. Okay, cool. So that's two examples of the Socratic method. In a bit, we're going to go into Socrates' apology, which isn't really an apology at all, but it's really the story of his trial. But before we do that, we're going to take a 5-minute break. And you guys can use the restroom, get some water, eat some food, something like that. I'll be here. Answer any questions in the QQ chat, and I'll see you back here at, well, let's say 10:02. But yeah, so they've been translated into English, and they've been translated into modern English. These are very famous passages. So what we're reading here is translations and people making an effort to make us understand. And part of the problem with that is some of the concepts and terms that the ancient Greeks used aren't ones that exist in English. So there's always a question of, are we really understanding it in the same way that the ancient Greeks would have? And it's a hard thing to know. So basically, to answer your question, we do get the benefit of translation here. The apology is, presumably as long in Greek as it is in English. So with regards to beauty is friend, friend is beauty, then divided into 3 groups of beauty. So he doesn't argue that beauty is friend. He argues that beauty is good, and that the good is the beautiful, which is a very Greek argument to make. And so that's sort of his point, is when he's starting to make arguments about the good, the evil, and the neither good nor evil, he puts the beautiful clearly in the category of the good. And he says they're basically the same thing. And when you say Socrates' analogy is extreme, that he calls sickness evil, it's very hard to understand if he's calling sickness evil as like a analogy, because it seems like that to us. But if you read his argument directly, it seems like he actually thinks there is something evil about sickness. Again, like, the problem is with his arguments, when he uses his analogies, he relies on his conversation partner having the same background as he does. So like when he says sickness is evil, Menexenus, who's, a man who has the same education as Socrates, says, yes, sickness is evil. To us, it's like hard to tell if that's something they believe or if that's something they sort of understand as poetic. Like, when I say my computer hates me, I don't literally mean my computer hates me, but I can say that to you guys and you would understand what I mean. The computer doesn't work as well as I want it to. So yeah, it is very difficult to understand. Luckily for us, the apology is not quite so difficult to understand. So it's now 10:04, so let's begin with the apology. And let me close out that. and presentation. Okay, so the main text that we'll be covering today, and remember we cover a different text every day, is Socrates' Apology, or to use the Greek, Apologia, which is his defense at his trial. It's not him, even though the word apology in English means I'm sorry, you know, let me see if I can get my pronunciation right now. Dobuchi. And it doesn't mean that in Greek. In Greek, it means he's explaining his actions. There's a dispute about what Socrates Doibuchi. I'm trying. Chinese is a hard language. There's a dispute about what Socrates actually said. There's one version, as I mentioned, from Xenophon and one version from Plato. Plato's version is probably better written than what Socrates actually said. Xenophon's version, however, is quite frankly sort of stupid and not worth reading. So we're going to read Plato's version. And here I've taken from that same painting, Socrates, Plato, Socrates points up, Plato to the ground. So without any further ado, let's go ahead. So first Socrates starts with an actual apology. He actually says, sorry, I am more than 70 years of age, and this is the first time that I have ever appeared in a court of law, and I'm quite a stranger to the ways of the place, and therefore I would have you regard me as if I were really a stranger, who would expose if he spoke in his native tongue and after the fashion of his country. So he says, I'm an old man, I've never been in court before, and I'm not a lawyer. So forgive me if I don't speak like a lawyer. Instead, I speak like a philosopher. After he says that, he says, as a philosopher, let me first identify the accusation against me. So the accusation is that Socrates is an evildoer and a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. So Socrates is an evildoer, does bad thing, curious person, and curious here we have to understand is a more serious accusation than it is in English. So, you know, we think, why would you be in a court for being curious? Well, this makes it very clear. He searches into things under the earth and in heaven. So he said he's looking into things that he really shouldn't have. These are stuff that should be like reserved for the gods and the priests, and Socrates is looking into them anyways. And he makes the worse appear the better cause. So Socrates, you know, he corrupts people by teaching that the worse is better. And I got this from a Korean drama, by the way, in case you're wondering why Socrates looks Korean. But so let's go into the first section here. So we've got how Socrates actually got into trouble in the first place. So why did Socrates end up in this court of law? So a friend of Socrates asked the oracle to tell him whether there is anyone wiser than I was. And the Pythian prophetess answers, there's no man wiser. So he goes to this legendary oracle, someone who gets her knowledge straight from the gods. And the oracle, normally who would be very vague about things like this. You know, I don't know if you've ever gotten your fortune told or anything like that, but the way they normally, handle it is they'll say, well, something bad will happen in the future, but then something good will happen as well. And I mean, it's true, so you can't be wrong, or you can't be mad at them, and you still have to pay them their fee. And that's how Greek prophets work too. But Socrates' friend gets a rare straight answer who just says, yeah, Socrates is the wisest man alive. So Socrates, yes, a great king will die is another famous one. If you invade this country, a great king will die. All right. So Socrates, being Socrates, he hears this and he immediately says, well, that can't be right. You know, yeah, she gets her knowledge straight from the gods, but she can't be right about this. So he goes to find a man wiser than him. It really doesn't go that well. So he goes to one who had the reputation of wisdom and observed to him. His name I need not mention. He was a politician whom I selected for examination, and the result was as follows. When I began to talk with him, I could not help thinking that he was not really wise, although he was thought wise by many, wiser still by himself, and went and tried to explain to him that he thought himself wise, but was not really wise. The consequence was that he hated me, and his enmity was shared by several who were present and heard me. So just to be clear about what Socrates does here is he hears this, he says, this must be wrong. So he goes to a politician who's famous for being wise, and he talks with him. And he thinks, this guy isn't that wise. He thinks he's wise. Other people think he's wise. So I thought, as someone, if I thought I was wise, but I wasn't really, I'd want someone to tell me. So I went and told him, I know you think you're smart, but you're really not that smart. And Socrates is like, it turns out that he didn't like that. And so now he and his friends hate me. Socrates is not happy with just that, though. He says, I do not suppose that either of us knows anything really beautiful and good. I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. In this latter particular, then, I seem to have slightly the advantage of him. So Socrates says, I'm wiser than the politician. Neither of us really knows anything, but I know that I know nothing. He thinks that he knows something. That's one more fact I have than him. So he gives up on politicians and instead he turns to poets. He says, it doesn't go so well. He says, it showed me in an instant that not by wisdom do poets write poetry, but by a sort of genius and inspiration. They're like diviners or soothsayers who also say many fine things, but do not understand the meaning of them. The poets appear to be much in the same case, and I further observe that upon the strength of their poetry, they believe themselves to be the wisest of men and other things in which they are not wise. So Socrates says, poets, they write great poetry, but I don't think they really understand what they're saying when they write it. It's like a prophet who can say fine things because the gods tell them, but they don't actually know what they're saying. And he says, even more than that, poets don't realize that they're not that wise, and they actually think they're smart in things in which they're not that smart. So once again, Socrates says, turns out that I'm the wisest man because I know that I know nothing. He turns to artisans like sculptors, painters, that sort of thing, and he says, they're not that wise. So now Socrates has gone to all of Athens, and he has told all of Athens that he has gone to basically every famous man in Athens, tried to figure out if he's smart, found out that he isn't. So all of Athens is mad at him, but Socrates is pretty happy with himself. He's figured out the riddle here. He's figured out the problem. It says, God only is wise. And in this oracle, he means to say that the wisdom of men is little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates. He's only using my name as an illustration, as if he said, he, O men, is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. So Socrates, by the way, seems to have been monotheistic, even though he was living in a society which believed in many gods, because he only mentions one. He says, only God is wise. And when he says Socrates is the wisest of all men, he's just saying that men should know they don't know anything. And they should be like Socrates, who knows that he knows nothing. And so I go my way, obedient to the God, and make inquisition into the wisdom of anything, whether citizen or stranger, who appears to be wise. If he is not wise, then in vindication of the oracle, I show him that he is not wise. This occupation quite absorbs me. No time to give either to any public matter of interest or to any concern of my own, but I am in utter poverty by reason of my devotion to the God. So really, when he's going around showing everyone that they're stupid, he's really just trying to help the oracle. He's trying to prove the oracle right. And that's what his entire life at this point is devoted to, proving that no one knows anything. And by the way, this is supposedly where Socrates went to receive his prophecy. The oracle would sit in the center here, and you would ask her questions. And it's sort of debated about how exactly she got her answers. People think she probably took some sort of drugs and then hallucinated. Pretty interesting. And yeah, seems like a fun occupation. Better than Socrates, anyways, of going around proving to people that they're dumb. But so now Socrates has ended the first part of his defense. Again, he's not a lawyer. He's a philosopher. He's identified one part of the thesis. Socrates makes the wrong appear right. And he says, no, really, I didn't make the wrong appear right. All I was trying to show is that people aren't as wise as they think they are. So now Socrates has the second part of his accusation. The idea that Socrates is an evildoer who corrupts the youth. But Socrates says instead of this, he identifies his accuser, who is Meletus, and he says, Meletus says that I am a doer of evil who corrupts the youth, but I say, O men of Athens, that Meletus is a doer of evil. The evil is that he makes a joke of a serious matter. He is too ready at bringing other men to trial from a pretended zeal and interest about matters in which he never really had the smallest interest. So Meletus is in fact the bad guy here. Meletus, what he does, the bad thing that he does, is that he's brought trial against Socrates, against something that he pretends to really care about, but really Meletus doesn't care about this. By the way, I've represented Meletus here as Dwight Schrute from the American sitcom The Office, who I believe has a similar personality to what Meletus does. So in the following Socratic dialogue, the part of Meletus will be played by Dwight Schrute. So are you guys with me so far? You understand so far? All right, great. So then let's go on to our Socratic dialogue. So Socrates is trying to prove that Meletus is in fact someone who has never thought about this issue before, and he's brought trial against Socrates just because he's a jerk. And so Socrates says, come hither, Meletus, let me ask a question of you. You think a great deal about the improvement of youth? Meletus, have you, thought about how to improve youth before? Corruption of youth? Like, this isn't something that you're just suddenly coming up with out of nowhere? And Meletus, of course, says, yes, I do. And Socrates says, well, tell the judges then, who improves the youth? And Meletus said, the laws. Makes sense. But Socrates says, but that, my good sir, is not my meaning. I want to know who the person is who, in the first place, knows the laws. You can't say that the laws improve the youth, because that's just a thing written down in the book. It's really asking who knows the laws. Who's the person who's improving the youth? Meletus responds, the judges who are present in court. Makes sense? That's who improved the youth. Socrates clarifies, what do you mean to say, Meletus? They're able to instruct and improve youth? Certainly they are. So now Socrates, see what he's doing here? He's establishing his thesis, and then he's going to negate it. Socrates, what, all of them, or some only and not others? All of them. So he's starting to establish a universal thesis. Here, that is good news. There are plenty of improvers then. What do you say of the audience then? Do they improve them? Yes, they do. And the senators? Yes, the senators improve them. But perhaps the members of the citizen assembly corrupt them. Or do they too improve them? They improve them. Then every Athenian improves and elevates them, all with the exception of myself, and I alone am their corrupter. Is that what you affirm? That is what I stoutly affirm. So at this point, Socrates has now established a thesis. Every Athenian improves and elevates the youth, except for Socrates. And Meletus has to know at this point that this is an impossible thesis, and that Socrates is going to have an easy time negating it. But he sticks with it, and so now Socrates argues by analogy that that's ridiculous. He says, I am very unfortunate if that is true. But suppose I ask you a question. Would you say that this also holds true in the case of horses? Does one man do them harm and all the world good? It's not the exact opposite of this true. One man is able to do them good, or at least not many. The trainer of horses, that is to say, does them good, and others who have to do with them rather injure them. So Socrates' analogy is teaching the youth is like teaching horses. And it's sort of ridiculous to say that the entire world is a great teacher of horses and one guy is a terrible teacher. Really, it's just trainers of horses teach horses well, and everyone else has no idea what they're doing. So Socrates then proves that this analogy holds true, which I've skipped over for the sake of time. And so then he goes on to the next accusation. So he's sort of establishing that Meletus's accusation is ridiculous, that Socrates alone is the corrupter of youth. So he's going to go on to the next one here. And now, Meletus, I must ask you another question. Which is better, to live among bad citizens or among good ones? Answer, friend, for that is a question which may be easily answered. Do not the good do their neighbors good, and the bad do them evil? So here we've got categorizations again, right? We've got the good and the bad. Good do good, bad do evil. This one doesn't seem quite as foreign to us as the one we read before. It seems sort of reasonable, maybe rather simplistic to just say there's such a thing as bad people and good people, because people are complex. But we can understand where Socrates is coming from. And Meletus apparently certainly can, because he just says, certainly. Socrates says, is there anyone who would rather be injured than benefited by those who live with him? Answer, my good friend. The law requires you to answer. Does anyone like to be injured? Certainly not. And when you accuse me of corrupting and deteriorating the youth, do you allege that I corrupt them intentionally or unintentionally? So you might be able to see where Socrates is going here. It says, now when you've said that I corrupt the youth, are you saying I did it on purpose? And before he asked here, Socrates, like, does anyone want to be injured? And up here, he says, do the good do their neighbors good, and the bad do them evil. So he's going to establish his Meletus' thesis here, and then he's going to show that it's ridiculous. So Meletus' thesis that Socrates intentionally corrupted the youth is ridiculous, because the good do their neighbors good, then evil do them evil. Now that is a truth which your superior wisdom has recognized thus early in life. And am I at my age in such darkness and ignorance as not to know that if a man with whom I have to live is corrupted by me, I am very likely to be harmed by him, and yet I corrupt him, and intentionally too. So Socrates says, well, you said good people are good to their neighbors, bad people are bad to their neighbors. So why would Socrates corrupt the people he lives with if bad people are going to do bad things to him? If he makes them bad, then that's going to be bad for him. So it's same thing as before. Identifies the accusation, negates it, argues by analogy. Identifies second accusation, negates it, and then he argues by categories, the good, the bad, and neighbors. And he relies on these definitions of these categories, which again are something that people agree with based on common sense, to show the accusation doesn't make sense. If you disagree with his definitions, his argument would fall apart. So for instance here, the good do their neighbors good and the bad do them evil. If Meletus says, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. What are good? Who are the good? Who are their neighbors? Are those the people living right next to them? Like I don't know everyone has like necessarily those sorts of interactions with people living next to them. I mean, Socrates' argument would fall apart, right? So here, he needs these categories for his argument to make sense. And he needs this shared knowledge for everyone to understand exactly what he means. If he doesn't have that shared knowledge, then it doesn't make sense. All right, cool. Is everyone with me? That was the Socratic argument. Everyone understands the Socratic argument there. All right, great. Let's go on. And here Meletus, as played by Dwight Schrute, is very upset. Tabu Gaoxing, I think. Is that how you say happy? I think so. All right. I'm gonna keep trying on my Chinese. By the end of this course, my Chinese is gonna be as good as your philosophy. So now Socrates has defeated Meletus. He proved Meletus wrong. So in this third section, he states an overall defense of himself and what he's been doing in Athens. So this is kind of a stirring speech here. Strange indeed would be my conduct, O men of Athens, if I, who when I was ordered by the generals whom you chose to command me at Potidaea and Amphipolis and Delium, remained where they placed me like any other man facing death. If I say now, when as I conceive and imagine, God orders me to fulfill the philosopher's mission, searching into myself and other men, I were to desert my post through fear of death. So Socrates says, it's strange, you know me as a brave soldier. You know that when I faced death, I remained where I was. I wasn't scared. I've told you that I thought this is God's mission for me. You won't convince me to abandon God's mission of me because you threatened to kill me. I believe that to this day, no greater good has ever happened in the state than my service to the God. For I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons and your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. So he says, I am the best thing that has ever happened to Athens. I improve the souls of the citizens of Athens. Don't care, I'm telling you, don't care about your riches, care about your soul. This is a very like philosophical way of looking at it, right? So now that he's just stated that defense of his actions, he says, this is what will happen if you kill me. I would have you know that if you kill such a one as I am, you will injure yourselves more than you will injure me. Meletus and Anytus will not injure me. They cannot, for it is not in the nature of things that a bad man should injure better than himself. I do not deny that he may perhaps kill him or drive him into exile or deprive him of civil rights. He may imagine, and others may imagine, that he is doing him a great injury, but in that I do not agree with him. The evil doing as Anytus is doing, unjustly taking away another man's life, is greater far. So Socrates says, if you kill me, you are going to hurt Athens more than you will hurt me. Meletus and Anytus aren't going to be the ones who will hurt me. They're not good men, and bad men can't hurt good men. Bad men can kill good men. Bad men can exile good men, can imprison good men, and you can think that you're injuring them, but you're not. You're not injuring them. Because really what you're doing is you're doing an injury to the state. You're not injuring me, you're injuring the state. I am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long in all places am always fastening upon you, rousing and persuading and reproaching you. And as you will not easily find another like me, I would advise you to spare me. So he describes himself again. I'm a gadfly. I am the gadfly which God has given the state. I won't allow you to just sleep. I won't allow you to be happy with what you are. Instead, I persuade you. I make you realize when you're wrong. I tell you when you're bad. You're not going to find another person like me, so don't kill me. And the gadfly, it's like the biting flies on horses, right? I don't know if you guys have ever been bitten by one of them, but they hurt quite a bit. They have a strong bite. So that's how Socrates describes himself. And by the way, this is a very stirring speech, but you also can imagine what the judges are thinking as they listen to this. You know, they went into this expecting Socrates to apologize, to say, I'm an old man, like, why would you kill me? Like, all I did was talk. But instead, Socrates is saying, if you kill me, you are going to be hurting Athens. So we're very inspired by this. Socrates is probably not so inspired. Or sorry, the judges are probably not so inspired. They're probably a little annoyed. So, and then he actually goes for a practical defense. And he says, none of the youths that I've supposedly corrupted have come into court. None of their families have come into court. So it seems a little strange that you say, I've corrupted the youths, but you can't get any of them to actually admit they've been corrupted, or even their families to admit that. But he says, even though I have 3 sons, I won't beg for leniency, because that perverts justice, and justice is more important than just me. I will await judgment, and to you and to God I commit my cause, to be determined by you as is best for you and me. Socrates is a little sneaky here. He says, I won't beg for leniency because of my 3 sons, who will be homeless if I die. So, I mean, he is a little sneaky with mentioning his sons in there. But still, he says justice is too important. I can't say be lenient just because I have children. You need to pronounce the best sentence that you can think of. And by the way, this is what an Athenian court looks like. It's not like a formal court. It's just guys who stand up in front of an audience and they argue. And it's probably even less organized than this, because this is a painting done probably around the 1500s. So this is much, much, much later. But it's very informal. Unfortunately, Socrates' best attempt at saving himself fails, and he's condemned to death. They offer him one more time. They say, you can go. You can go somewhere else. Like, you can be exiled. Like, later on, like, his friends say, like, no one really wants to kill you. Like, the judges would totally be happy to be bribed, and then you wouldn't die. And Socrates still says no. Says, I'm not going to, like, avoid my punishment. I'm not going to fear death. Let us reflect in another way, and we shall see that there is great reason to hope that death is a good. For one of two things. Either death is a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, or as men say, there is a change in migration of the soul from this world to another. So there's a lot of reason to hope that death is good, because either death is a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, so either you don't think anything, or on the other hand, you go to heaven. Now, if you suppose that there is no consciousness, but a sleep like the sleep of him who is undisturbed even by the sight of dreams, death will be an unspeakable gain. So if there's no such thing as consciousness, then death has to be better than life. For if a person were to select the night in which his sleep was undisturbed even by dreams, were to compare with this the other days and nights of his life, then were to tell us how many days and nights he had passed in the course of his life better and more pleasantly than this one, I think that any man, I'll not say a private man, but even the great king, will not find many such days or nights when compared with the others. Now, if death is like this, I say that to die is to gain, for eternity is then only a single night. So, one last analogy from the great Socrates. If death is like a dreamless sleep, then dreamless sleeps are the best sleeps. So, isn't death then a gain? And by the way, this is a poetic, another artistic description of, or depiction of, the death of Socrates. Okay. His last words to the court are, the hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better, God only knows. And then Socrates commits suicide by drinking hemlock. So it's time for me to leave. Time for us to go our ways. I'll die, you live. Only God knows which one is the better. So, that is the end of the Apologia. Before we go into summary, are there any questions about it? Okay, everyone understand? Great. So is it meaningful to understand Socrates by Plato's version? That may be true or fake. Let me circle back to that once we finish our summary. But that's a good question. Okay, so summary, Apologia, all the reasons as to why Socrates is considered the father of philosophy present in this piece. So first, Socrates defends the importance of seeking truth at all costs and assumes there is a truth to be found. So that's philosophy at its best, right? We need to seek truth, and we can find truth. It uses logic and analogy to win an argument by common sense. Philosophy, logic, eloquently defends the role of the philosopher in the state, and then insists until the bitter end on his and others' ignorance. So that's really, if we think about core values of philosophy, those are pretty much your core values. And Socrates states all of them in his defense. And so they'll be modified and expanded upon by future philosophies after Socrates. They'll remain evident every text that we read. Every philosopher that we cover will, in some sense, believe these 4 points. Seeking truth is important. There is truth to be found. Logic can help us find that truth. Analogy can help us find that truth. Philosophers have an important role to play, and that none of us know anything from the get-go. We have to argue and discover in order to know things. So next time we'll cover Aristotle. So that is Socrates' intellectual descendant, and Aristotle will get more interesting, a little more difficult, a lot more fun. That'll be good. So for next time, attempt the reading. So try to read Apologia, reread the pre-reading, or if you haven't read it yet, read it for the first time, make sure you understand it. Answer the homework questions, which should be up on QQ. If they're not, they will be very soon. At least 2 sentences in English per question. Come to Reddit. I'll post up a thread where you can post your best homework response, and then you guys can discuss and argue and ask questions. And then if you liked the course today, please post about it on social media, tell your friends, WeChat, Weibo, whatever you use. I think a couple of you are even on Facebook. So if you like the course, that'd be a great help for me. Hopefully it'll make the course more lively too. I mean, in the end, really all of this depends on you guys, right? You're the students, you're who this course is for. So yeah, all right, good stuff. Now, thank you very much for bearing with me. We have some time for questions. Let's cover the question I saw here. First, is it meaningful to understand Socrates by Plato's version? Yeah, I mean, so we do have an issue of how much are we really understanding? But like you sort of get that issue with a lot of people from that long ago, right? Is records aren't that great, and it does appear that Plato is recording Socrates at least somewhat accurately. Like there definitely was a man named Socrates, and he definitely did manage to annoy most of Athens. So Plato's version seems reasonable. So it's probably not entirely true, but it's the best we have. So gods of the state. Well, when Socrates talks about it, he talks about the god, which is presumably some god that he personally believes in. Athens had their own patron gods. Each city-state has their own god. Athens was Athena, I think. So that would be generally what Socrates would be referring to. But Greek religion isn't super organized at this time. So gods is a bit of a vague thing. And there's actually a point in the Apologia that I skipped over where he argues about the Greek gods and whatever. Good question. And there's a poster of me in the QQ chat. No problem. All right. Any other questions about me, about the course, about Socrates? Any other questions? If bad people do good to others, what will happen? I mean, I think that's sort of just a limitation of Socrates' categorizations, that the idea that bad people can do good or good people can do bad. So yeah, it's very hard to it's hard for me to like argue about Socrates' categorizations because I honestly I think they're very much a Greek cultural thing that's like hard to understand in our modern era. Is it true that Socrates is afraid of his wife? No, you are thinking of Pericles. So there's the famous quote by Pericles, who remember is the greatest Greek statesman, where he says, my infant son rules Athens, because he says, I rule Athens, my wife rules me, my infant son rules my wife, therefore my infant son rules Athens. But no, Socrates wasn't even married, I don't think. I don't think Socrates was married. At least his wife does not come up often in his dialogues. So I would assume he was not married, but I'm not sure. Apparently I'm wrong. Well, let's see. Plato mentions her once. Xenophon mentions her once. And in Xenophon, Xenophon records her as Plato mentions her once and says she's devoted. Xenophon mentions her and says she is the hardest to get along with of all the women that there are. So according to Xenophon, she is shrewish and mean and whatever. So depends if you follow Xenophon or Plato. All right. What if Meletus? So if Meletus said that he like it's unintentionally. Yeah. So that would sort of defeat Meletus's argument, though, that he unintentionally corrupts the youth. You can't really like accuse someone then of like it's not a crime to unintentionally corrupt the youth. So that would be sort of a not great accusation on Meletus's part. So did Socrates' words show some dialectic thinking? Yes. So I think that's sort of like the beginning of dialectic thinking. So if I confront unsolvable problems, my father says you can find solutions from philosophy. So did most philosophers really live a happier life? So Socrates is actually an example of someone who lives a happy, fulfilled life. So I think Socrates is actually a good example. And much later in the course, when we cover how to live, we'll cover the Stoics, who are inspired by Socrates for an example of how to live a happy life. Or if not a happy life, then at least a fulfilled life. I would say there are a lot of unhappy philosophers, though. We'll cover some philosophers, in fact, who are desperately unhappy and even depressed. So I won't say all philosophy is guaranteed for a happy life, but Socrates' philosophy seems to be conducive to a happy life. Could Socrates be convinced to escape from prison by other philosophers that didn't live in Socrates' time? I don't know. You'd have to. I mean, we'd have to write a story and find out. If you come up with some theories about other philosophers that could have persuaded Socrates to escape from prison, I'd be happy to read them, and I'd be very interested to read them. Is philosophy like a kind of religion? No. So philosophy isn't a religion. Philosophy is a practice, right? Western philosophy is a tradition of people who have practiced certain ways of thinking. But saying it's a religion that brings comfort to people sometimes is, well, let's to put it this way: if in your life you ever use technology, like if you ever, I don't know, presumably you're watching this on a laptop or a smartphone or whatever, you can thank philosophy for that. It's the rigorous thinking of philosophy is what brought us science. Wherever you live, whether it's probably China, the Chinese government, how was that organized? Well, philosophy. There wasn't such a organized system of government 2,000 years ago. So, I mean, really, if you think about how best to treat people in the world, again, philosophy. So yeah, I really wouldn't describe it as a kind of religion. Is philosophy a compulsory course for college students? I'm assuming you mean in America. Depends on the college. Most colleges, it is not compulsory. I think it should be, but it's not. So did he ever try to influence the state of Athens? Socrates, I'd say Socrates never tried to become a statesman. He certainly talked to he certainly tried to influence politicians, but I don't think he ever tried to become a statesman. Does a philosopher possess religion? Some philosophers are religious. They're actually, one of the philosophers we'll cover in 2 lessons. One is a Jew and the other is a Christian, a Catholic. And we'll see how they deal with religion. There is tension between question everything and a religion which says these are certain things which are true and you can't question. So some philosophers are religious. I would say there's always a tension, though, between philosophy and religion. In fact, I'd say, I mean, given that they're men of their time and that most men throughout history have been religious, I'd say most philosophers are religious. In his exchange with Gorgias, he thinks life is a leaking jar that you need to fill continuously, although it is leaking forever. Gorgias' student Callicles thinks that life is a complete jar, not leaking anything, and you only need to fill it once, and it's done. Which opinion do you personally prefer? That's a complicated question. I would say I'd have to think a lot more before I'd feel comfortable aligning myself on either side of that argument. But if you're still curious, post about it on Reddit, and we'll see what. And I'll come up with a good response, and we'll get other people to write good responses as well. All right. Religion is about faith, others, zeal, and piety. Yes and no. I mean, we'll see various debates about what religion is and what religion isn't. It's a complicated term, and it's evolved a lot, and there's been a lot of different forms of religion. So I wouldn't be quite so quick to categorize it like that. So why we focus on Socrates and Aristotle but skip Plato? I would say the biggest reason we don't skip Plato entirely. Plato is covered in state building. He's our first in How Things Should Work, with Plato's Republic and the Ideal City. With regards to Plato's other philosophy, theory of forms and whatever, I skip it largely because I'm mostly in like Russell's analytic tradition. There's a great conflict. There's a great like story about Russell and his mentor and collaborator, Whitehead. Whitehead was a big fan of Plato. Russell hated Plato. And Whitehead once introduced Russell at a speech by saying, I think Russell is simple-minded while he thinks I am muddle-headed. So really it's a question of, is Platonic philosophy, which is sort of more mysticism and less, cold hard logic, is that something that appeals to you? To me, it's not something that I think is worth spending an entire class on, although I do recognize the influence. I mean, philosophy, all of what we cover in this course has to be, to some extent, personal choice, right? There's too many philosophers. We can't cover all 2,500 years of Western philosophy in a single course. So part of it is personal choice. If this was taught by someone else, it's entirely possible they would spend a lecture talking about Plato. How philosophers solve conflicts between philosophy and religion depends on the philosopher. It gets very, very tricky. It also gets even more tricky once we get into a point of history in which people are regularly killed for disagreeing with religion, in which case they have to be even more careful. Because once philosophers get into, like, for example, the Middle Ages, a lot of them won't disagree with religion just because that's a good way to lose your head. So then, yeah, it gets quite tricky. All right. Pleasure and pain exist together. Drinking is an example that you are getting a pleasure of being less thirsty, and your pain that pleasure is decreasing thirst any second you drink. Is it similar to Chinese dialectic philosophy of Zhuangzi? I don't know Chinese philosophy nearly as well as I should. I mean, there's not, I could say there's not great Western sources and I can't read Chinese, but it's also just, I haven't really taken the opportunity to learn. So I wish I could answer your question, but I don't know Chinese philosophy well enough. Okay. And with that, with admitting my own ignorance in the best Socratic fashion, I think that covers Socrates pretty well. I know nothing, but at least I know that I know nothing. See you on Reddit. See you on, well, Saturday for Aristotle. And yeah, if you liked the course, if you thought it was interesting or fun, post about it on social media. Not mandatory, of course, but it would be nice. And yeah, it was a pleasure. See you in a bit.